Beginning in July, this label, which you're about to see, Parental Advisory, Explicit Lyrics, will appear on albums whose songs explicitly deal with sex, violence, suicide, and substance abuse. The label will appear on the lower right-hand corner at the discretion of record companies and individual artists.
This moment in 1990, when the Parental Advisory label for albums first got introduced, was one of the most highly publicized events in pop culture history. This little black label is a fact of life nowadays, but there is something important and subtle in this news clip that's often misunderstood.
The label will appear on the lower right-hand corner at the discretion of record companies and individual artists.
A lot of people assume that this label was created by the government, but it's a little-known fact that the Recording Industry Association of America voluntarily created this label to placate parents that were concerned about what music their children were listening to. Most people don't actually know what the label means outside of a vague understanding that there will be some type of profanity on the album, and that's because from the start it was designed to be ambiguous. To understand how we got here with this useless label, we need to go back to the 80s when MTV actually still played music videos.
Coming soon on cable, your stereo and TV unite to bring you video music in stereo 24 hours a day. You better run!
The 1980s were exploding with new music that pushed the envelope, and artists like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and AC/DC became worldwide phenomena and changed what it meant to be a superstar. But some parents that viewed some of this new music as crass and inappropriate were not exactly happy with the direction music was going in, and in 1985, a group was formed by 4 women called the Parent Music Resource Center, or PMRC. Tipper Gore, Susan Baker, Pam Howard, and Sally Nevius founded the organization with the intent to expand censorship of music, giving parents more control over what music their children were listening to. Known as the Washington Wives, this group of women were very well connected in Washington, D.C., being married to Vice President Al Gore, Treasury Secretary James Baker, Washington Realtor Raymond Hauer, and former Washington City Council Chairman John Nevius. With their political connections and financing from the Beach Boys and the Coors Brewing Company, they successfully started a national conversation about putting restrictions on explicit music. They were focused mainly on fighting against rock, metal, and pop music that they deemed to be offensive, with most of the concern being around sexually suggestive lyrics. One of the tactics they used to garner support with parents was creating a list that they called the Filthy 15, which was a list of 15 songs they considered to be the worst offenders. Looking at some of the songs featured on the list, like Madonna's Dress You Up, it's comical what used to be considered taboo when you compare it to today's standards. Madonna talking about velvet kisses and satin sheets was apparently too much to handle back then, but the 80s were a wildly different time, and many parents agreed that these types of songs were corrupting their children. The PMRC pushed for a lot more extreme measures, like forcing record stores to put explicit albums out of view, pressuring TV networks to not broadcast explicit music videos, and even getting large record labels to reassess their contracts with artists who perform explicit songs. They also suggested a standard rating system for music like the MPA has for movies, but RIAA ultimately rejected all of their proposals. I'm not sure I want to give RIAA too much credit here, considering their reasons for opposing these restrictions were financially motivated, but thankfully their interest aligned with everyone who opposed censorship due to free speech. The conflict between RIAA and the PMRC lasted for months and culminated in a hearing with the United States Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation on September 19, 1985.
The concern is that the public at large should be aware of the existence of this kind of music and the fact that it is now available to kids.
Multiple high-profile musicians were called to testify opposing censorship, including Dee Snider of Twisted Sister, John Denver, and Frank Zappa.
Mr. Chairman, this would approach censorship.
Americans all across the country were watching the hearing on live TV as one of the most important First Amendment debates in American history unfolded. It might be silly looking back what we know now, but some of the proponents of censoring explicit music in this hearing held extreme views on censorship, like Senator Ernest Hollings.
And yet I would make the exception that if I could find some way constitutionally to do away with it, I would.
To say that this hearing was a circus would be a modest way of putting it, with the Washington Wives using rape and suicide statistics as reasons to censor rock and pop music.
Teen pregnancies and teenage suicide rates are at epidemic proportions today. Rape is up 7% in the latest statistics.
Contrast that with Dee Snider walking into the hearing with a denim tank top and long flowing hair, telling Tipper Gore that she had a dirty mind for misinterpreting one of the Twisted Sisters songs.
In this article, Ms. Gore claimed that one of my songs, Under the Blade, had lyrics encouraging sadomasochism, bondage, and rape. As the creator of Under the Blade, I can say categorically that the only sadomasochism, bondage, and rape in this song is in the mind of Ms. Gore.
Even the story behind why this hearing was happening in the first place was borderline satire. Tipper Gore recalled getting the album Purple Rain by Prince for her daughter and was shocked to realize that female masturbation was mentioned in one of the songs. This one event was arguably the origin of the PMRC and also why this hearing was happening in the first place, and it inadvertently caused Tipper Gore to have one of the first boomer moments live in front of Congress.
I bought the Purple Rain album for our 11-year-old, and I didn't know that Darling Nikki was on it, and I felt that it was inappropriate for her and her 8- and 6-year-old sister to hear a song describing a girl masturbating in a hotel lobby with a magazine.
The hearing was cemented into pop culture history because of moments like these, but the artist called in to testify also made legitimate efforts to raise concerns about free speech and the financial impact of censorship. Their efforts were wasted though, as nobody knew it at the time, but the last nail in the coffin was set before the hearing even started because RIAA had already made a deal with the PMRC and the senators to voluntarily place a modified version of the Parental Advisory label on explicit music. The reason behind this backdoor deal varies depending on who you ask, but it's been speculated that RIAA caved because the PMRC was using their leverage to block a bill that would require licenses on all recording audio devices and media that would generate over $200 million per year for the recording industry. Whatever the case may be, the end result was a little black label that says Parental Advisory explicit lyrics being slapped onto the corner of explicit albums. There are many reasons why this label miserably failed to do what the PMRC wanted it to, but the most obvious reason is that the guidelines that RIAA lays out for using the label are not mandatory and also aren't standardized. You could put the label on any album that isn't even explicit as long as you pay RIAA a licensing fee, or you could ignore it entirely and just not place it on an album that is exclusively you saying the word f over and over. Look no further than Frank Zappa making an absolute mockery out of the label by placing it on his album Jazz from Hell that was entirely instrumental with zero lyrical content. One of the original goals of the label was to give parents more information about the music their children were listening to, but considering how vague it is, parents don't actually get any valuable information out of the label. On top of that, minors are allowed to buy albums with this label on them in most circumstances. I think this is one of the most common misconceptions about the Parental Advisory label that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Whether or not a minor is allowed to buy an album with this label on it is entirely up to the individual retailer's discretion for the most part. The only exception to this would be an album that doesn't pass the Miller test. The Miller test is a 3-part test used by the Supreme Court in the United States to determine whether speech or expression is obscene and not protected by the First Amendment. If a work falls under this legal definition of obscene, it can't be sold to anyone under the age of 16, but the amount of albums that have failed this test in court can be counted on one hand. Hilariously, the label did the exact opposite of what the PMRC wanted it to, and it sort of became a "this album is cool" sticker to a lot of young people during the 90s. A lot of industry insiders were also worried that it would impact album sales, but the evidence on this is mixed on whether or not this was actually the case. However, one consequence of the label was the introduction of clean versions of songs that were played on radio stations and sold in stores. Multiple stores like Walmart started carrying only clean versions of songs to brand themselves as family friendly, which forced a lot of artists to create clean versions if they wanted to get radio play or sell their albums in certain stores. To me, this was one of the real downsides of the label being introduced because especially when I was a kid, it was harder to find original versions of songs on YouTube that weren't censored. It's also something that artists despise because it degraded the artistic integrity of the original song if they were forced to create a clean version to get radio airtime. There were also a few high-profile cases of artists having their albums ruled as obscene, like 2 Live Crew's 1989 album As Nasty as They Wanna Be, but that ruling was later overturned. It's strange to look back and see the massive fight that took place in the 80s and early 90s about the label when it's barely talked about in the modern day. As for my opinion on it, I think the sticker on the 1991 Guns N' Roses album Use Your Illusion says it best. This album contains language which some listeners may find objectionable. They can fuck off and buy something from the New Age section. Thank you guys for watching, stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video.